Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we're gathering is situated upon the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, and the Métis Nation. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Andrew Benedetto, President of CRPO, and with me is Deb Adams, Registrar. We have a member of council, Carol Cowan-Levine, in the back. You may recognize Carol's name as having been president for quite a number of years through the Transitional Council and the first 3 years of the college. So, Carol, welcome. We're excited to be here, and we'd like to thank you for taking time out of your schedule, and certainly on a rainy afternoon. This session was prompted by CRPO's strategic planning. We wanted to hear from members what they thought was important for the profession and what they thought was important for the college. As we thought about what we hope to accomplish in these town hall meetings, we realized there was an opportunity to both tell you about what the college is doing, but certainly very importantly is to listen to members. To meet our objective, we sent out a survey to all attendees last week, and thank you to those that were able to respond. We had about 25 or 26 responses, I believe. And as a result, staff went through your feedback, and we identified a number of themes that we're going to address today. The membership snapshot, you've probably seen some of these numbers already, I hope. Just to suggest that we are really growing. There's over 6,000 members, and to say that we're getting quite a number of applicants in the regular route to registration, which is actually surpassing what our estimates were. So we're a growing college. Next, I'll just speak briefly to what does a regulatory college do. And again, this is sort of to provide some clarification, because sometimes we'll see comments, and we saw this in some of the surveys, where people say, well, you know, the college should be doing X or should be doing Y. And so just to be clear what the regulatory college does versus what perhaps your professional association might do for you and the advocacy role that they can play. So the college is really here to protect the public interest. It sets entry to practice standards. It monitors the protected title, which is registered psychotherapist, as you'll know. It sets standards and guidelines. It runs the quality assurance program. It responds to complaints and reports. And it also keeps a current and comprehensive public register. So there may be issues when you look at this list that you think, well, what does the college do with respect to talking to levels of government and that sort of thing? And we'll be speaking to that today, but there's certainly a role where the college has a role, but there's also, perhaps more importantly in some ways, where your professional associations will do that for you. So I'll turn it over to Deb for this next slide.
Thank you. I'm happy to see everybody here, and like Andrew, I'm grateful that you braved the rain and a nasty, nasty day, so thank you. I'm just stepping in to sort of give you this slide to frame the rest of the presentation. This is a model of regulatory oversight that has been gaining real traction in England for the last 10 years, and it's starting to be seen in Canada and in other places like the UK and Australia. So rather than leave it to the end and sort of reveal this sort of approach that we're looking at, I wanted to give it to you right up front so that as we have our discussion, it's just a little bit of a lens, so you can sort of think about this as part of the philosophical approach that the college is taking. So this is from the Professional Standards Authority in the UK. They are the regulator of regulators. They oversee a college that I heard over the course of a conference in the last week regulates more than 700,000 people. So it's crazy the amount of different professions and the number of providers that they're actually responsible for. So they've done an awful lot of work to look over the last 10 years at the right balance. And so the scale is meant to sort of give you a sense of how the college will be looking at exerting the right amount of regulatory force. Essentially, the underpinnings is that of this philosophy is that it discourages the use of regulation if the risk can be addressed more effectively by the professional themselves. So I think particularly apt for an old profession that's newly regulated. Psychotherapists have been working in Ontario, well before the college arrived on the scene. So this is an opportunity for us to look at the way that the college has been crafted. And I would suggest that probably what you'd find if you went and looked at the work that had been done to date, that this right touch approach has just sort of happened happen naturally and organically. And the approach that the college has tried to take from the get-go is to look at what the professionals have been able to articulate through the people who are on the transitional council and the vast consultations that took place, so that the professionals were allowed to articulate what excellence looked like, and then the college has been working to create that framework to support excellence. There's essentially 8 elements or 8 questions that the Right Touch asks users to contemplate in planning work. So the first one is identify the problem before the solution. So part of what we're trying to do with these town halls and with our strategic planning is to go out and do as broad-based consultation as possible to hear from our members, so that if there are problems, you can help us to identify them. Quantify and qualify the risks. Don't make assumptions about how bad something is or what implications it might have. Actually look at the data that supports what the risk might be. Get as close to the problem as possible, hence talking to people who are actually on the front line providing services. Focus on the outcome. So what is it that we want to achieve? So as Andrew said, our job is public protection, so we want to build in public protection obviously to everything we do. But you'll hear through the course of the presentation today that one of the outcomes that constitutes public protection is a profession that's well supported and well sustained. So we see that as being very important. Use regulation only when necessary. So no sledgehammers where tweezers will do the work. Keep it simple. If you guys can't understand the regulations and the guidelines and the standards and policies that we're making you be accountable to, how are you possibly going to meet them? So that's part of our mandate as well. Check for unintended consequences. So make sure that some of the work that we're doing is not creating barriers to access to care. It's not creating issues, for example, for our members who work in teams and who have to work with other professionals and sort of fit in with the standards and guidelines and requirements that say, for example, a hospital might have for you. And then review and respond to change. So as Andrew said at the beginning, we did the survey right before you came this week, so thank you to those of you who took the time to do it. But the themes that we are looking at talking to you about and wanting to hear from you about today come from a number of places. So frequent questions to our information line and our information email account. We get a good number of those every day. Queries to our practice advisors, and we're going to talk about how that practice advisory service works later. Questions that we've had at other presentations that we've heard people ask and thought, aha, okay, this is something that the profession probably doesn't know about and needs to. In the surveys that you completed way back when we did the Save the Dates, and a meeting that we held with association representatives in May. So we're hoping that we captured things. As Andrew said, we have about 5, and we'll have time at the end to be able to go through and add things in that you may want to raise. I think you hopefully heard about the posters up to the side as well. Those are an opportunity for you if you feel shy and you don't want to write it down, or you don't want to speak, you can write it down. These are issues that you want to know about, that you want us to take to strat planning. And then the sheet on the far right is a sheet for questions. So if you have something that you think the rest of the profession would be interested in hearing, please slap the topic up there and we'll consider it for a future communique. So I wanted to start with ICRC, Inquiries, Complaints, and Reports Committee. I know that one of the things that regulators across the world, probably, certainly across the province here, is that members live in dread of their first complaint, and they worry that it's an automatic sort of mark on their record, and that it will add up to no end of trouble. And so we wanted to sort of address what we see in the way of complaints and talk about some statistics, hopefully to reassure you that the process is fair and thorough, and to give you some sense of what kind of issues we see come through. So this is over the course of the last 12 months. It comes from our annual report. You can see these are the themes of the complaint issues and the most frequent ones. I'll give you a few numbers if you're a numbers kind of person. Over the last fiscal year, we saw 39 new matters come before ICRC. 34 of them were complaints, meaning they came from a service recipient or someone close to the service recipient, and then 5 were registrar's investigations, which means they came out of other fact-finding that we might do. Of the complaints and reports where decisions were reached in the last fiscal, so before you try and do the math, it's not 39, right? 39 new complaints and reports last year, but we were processing complaints and reports from previous fiscals. So of the complaints and reports where decisions were reached and provided to the member, no action was taken in 8 cases. 5 members entered on agreement into remedial arrangements where they had professional development that they were obligated to do. 10 received written advice, from the panel that reviewed the complaint. 9 received in-person cautions. 10 were required to complete a specified continuing education or remediation program called a CRPO, which can include things like supervision, an ethics course, other formalized learning. 2 had their registration revoked because they provided false information on their applications, and that became obvious in the course of our investigation. And 2 cases were referred to discipline. So I won't spend a lot of time on that, other than to say that the information about the complaints process is posted on the website and it's available to you. Your associations are in the background supporting you and providing counsel and potentially lawyers if you need them. But that the college is duly obligated to see every complaint and report through to its end. It's one of our primary and our least proactive, most reactive regulatory tool. And as I said, we're very conscious that it's one of the things that, especially as a newly regulated profession who haven't had a lot of time to sort of sit with it and see what your colleagues' experience might look like, it's one of the things that makes people anxious. So QA resources, I wanted to talk about this a little bit. This is the other end of the spectrum in my mind, and certainly one of the things that the right touch approach tells us we should be focusing on. So this is the work that we do further upstream to help you avoid complaints and reports. And so I've given you just some stats on our practice advisory service, but just as a preamble to that, I wanted to note that we changed the QA submission dates last year in order to free up staff so that we had more people available on the ground to answer phones, reset passwords, give you technical support as you undertake your QA submission, just in terms of figuring out the system, and help guide you through the process as we know it's new. So that's all posted on the website as well. In addition to the activities that make up the quality assurance program, and just for information, that's professional development through self-assessment and learning activities, it's peer and practice reviews, as well as professional improvement. We've also been working hard to develop QA resources. So hopefully you will have seen the informed consent workbook that just came out. We have other things coming along the pipeline that are planned in the same vein. And then one of the things that we're really proud of is our practice advisory service. So these are the top 5 member queries. We get about 67 email and phone inquiries a month, and that seems to be trending up, not down. We, as I said, think it's really well aligned with Right Touch because it's a resource that's available for members, and we would really encourage you to use it. The 6 advisors are across the province. They practice from different modalities. One of them is a French speaker, and they are qualified, experienced RPs who know our standards back to front and who are available to provide help. How the system works is that staff triages calls and email inquiries and then passes them on to the advisors if they're needed. It's really a place where you can go to discuss practice issues. The questions are things like, how does standard X apply in my practice and what's going on today? Or I'm dealing with a serious issue, I don't know what to do next, what would you advise? I'm dealing with a situation where there's no perfect course of action, what should I do? So it's really, it's almost like having another supervisory voice in the background. It's not a yes or no, do this and you'll be fine, do that and you won't be kind of situation. It's really about providing information to help you think your way through the situation. So it relies on the standards as a guide, it points you to resources, and it helps you identify relevant considerations in making decisions in your practice. Does anybody have any questions about QA specifically or anything that you'd like to comment on? We're interested in hearing. We actually are really very engaged with making sure that the process works for our members. And so, as I said, it's one of the areas of focus that we've got. And once we get through the grandparenting tsunami, the goal is to really turn our attention to the work of developing resources in the QA front. Right, so unless you choose to be inactive for that time period, the QA requirements are an obligation. I guess what I would suggest is that the 40 hours over the 2 years can be spread out in whatever way works for you. We had somebody at a presentation we did last week who said they knew a colleague who takes a week and does everything in that week. Everybody has to manage their practice and their learning and the way that they want to engage with quality assurance as they see fit, but our suggestion would be really that you spread it out, and so 40 hours over 2 years. 40 hours over 2 weeks would be a lot. 40 hours over 2 years is we hope not too onerous, and it's very broad, right? There's an awful lot of things that fit into those baskets. So for sure, if you have questions about specifically what you're doing and how you can fit that in, email the practice advisory and we'll provide you with specific answers. But just in general, what I would suggest is that, again, this is part of the Right Touch approach that the Transitional Council took without even having that label for it, looking at a profession that is well engaged with lifelong learning and doing the kind of ongoing PD that we know that our members do, that the 40 hours was meant to sort of be representative of what would be, sort of reasonable and normal. But I appreciate it, life circumstances get in the way. I mean, that's the other piece that I would want to really encourage you, is that while there are things that are required of you in regulation and that there's not a lot of negotiating room on, there's also a group of humans upstairs, and we're very happy to have conversations with you. So if you run into problems, if you anticipate, proactive communication beforehand is always going to be easier, because then we can hopefully offer solutions, or at least mitigating sort of ideas, and then you're not trying to fix things after. So there is a wall between the quality assurance program and the other work that the college does, and that's the case for all regulators. That's part of the way that the QA program was crafted by government and by the regulators when it was put in place about 11 years ago. And so unless you call and divulge something that's so egregious that we can't not take, sort of investigative action, and the practice advisor will kind of give you that information before you engage with them. There is no exchange of information between the quality assurance and the rest of the college on a regular basis, and we're very, very careful to protect that. Thank you. So egregious, I mean, I don't, specifics, if you called and said that you'd been sexually assaulting one of your clients, I mean, that's pretty egregious, right? There's as many possibilities as there are people here. I mean, certainly when we look at complaints, and so again, not to connect those two things, but just to give you sort of the framework, we look at low risk, medium risk, and high risk, right? And so I'm going to talk when we get to the ICRC process about I talked about the different outcomes. And so taking no action, entering into a remedial agreement, written advice, those things are not intended to be punitive. They're meant to be supportive, although they come through the complaints process. It's to give members the opportunity to go back and fix those parts of their practice where they've obviously been lacking and that a complaint has resulted. And so, I'm reluctant to sort of stand up here and say this is okay, that's not. I think that it's really the process with the practice advisors is to help you understand what questions you need to ask, what information you need to gather. The kinds of stuff that they're going to talk about is pointing you back to the standards, thinking about your scope of practice, making sure you're documenting, seeking legal advice if it seems like that's something that's necessary. And of course, you're always welcome to do that. We do have members who come to the college represented. Not everybody does when there's a complaint. And so I think that the piece that you have to sort of frame QA as is that it's a proactive measure. So if you see a problem looming, that's when you should be making the call to QA. The practice advisors who work there are your colleagues. They're people who are subject to registration and regulation as well, and so they really work in the mix. They're on the ground doing the same, not necessarily the same modality or the same practice as you, but they're under the same obligations. So they're they're cognizant of the weight of needing to call the practice advisory. Yeah, I understand that fund comes from government. It's not something that the college themselves actually has, and so we don't receive any of that funding. And so any funding that we would be in a position to put out would be funding that we take in from membership. The only source of funding that we have is membership dues, and so it's not something we're in a position to offer as a new college. And the College of Social Work is quite rare. There are no health colleges that I'm aware of. Certainly the Nursing Association, for example, ONA, through their union, their professional association, they have funding for education, but the colleges don't typically do that. So clinical supervision, there's a number of issues here, so we probably want to stick on this one for a little while. So we know there's been a number of changes around clinical supervision in the last year or so that have affected how this works for members and the different questions that we're seeing coming forward through those sources that I've referenced a couple times. So one was the enactment of the college's criteria for clinical supervisors kicking in, and another was the proclamation of the Controlled Act, and we will be talking about that. But as it affects supervision, it's had implications because the way that the Controlled Act is actually written in legislation says that only members of the profession can supervise individuals who are seeking to qualify as a member of the profession, meaning psychologists must supervise psychologists, social workers must supervise social workers, RPs, et cetera, vis-a-vis the Controlled Act. And then the changes to the College of Psychologists standards, which we're conscious of having broad sort of reach in terms of the way that a lot of our members practice. So we can break it down and talk about each of those things separately. I want to sort of, I'm in your hands in terms of where you want to start. What I can tell you by way of background is that we have been engaged with our colleagues at the other Controlled Act colleges around the proclamation and the implications that that has had. I actually have a meeting with them next week. We're not done with sort of trying to figure out what the best way to work with that restriction. It sort of flies in the face of the other part of the RHPA that says if you have shared scope of practices, you should be doing everything you can to support interprofessional education and collaboration. So government is conscious that there's a tension there. Honestly, it's a drafting issue. You know, one part of the RHPA was written at one point, and then the Controlled Act part was written at another, and they didn't, it's a massive piece of work, and they didn't marry it up. They are conscious that it's an issue, and we'll continue to be feeding into that and looking at how we might be able to improve that situation. In terms of the change to the College of Psychologists policies, vis-a-vis supervision for the purposes of billing, they're not actually out of line with our position, right? If you look at the standards, the CRPO standards that dictate what a supervisory relationship looks like, it has to be legitimate, robust supervision. It has some agenda, or it has some outcomes that are expected. So it needs to be a contractual relationship in which a clinical supervisor engages with a supervisee, meaning actually meets with them to promote professional growth. It enhances the supervisee's use of self in the therapeutic process. It's an opportunity to discuss the direction of therapy, and it's a safeguard for the well-being of the client. So those situations where the supervision is really just for the purposes of using that psychologist billing number would not meet the College of Registered Psychotherapists standards as either. So while we haven't come out and said you must not be supervised for the sole purposes of billing, that's what the standards tell you. And so the CPO, College of Psychologists, has taken this opportunity to really tighten up and be more directive and a bit more prohibitive in terms of how that works. It happened to coincide with the proclamation of the Controlled Act, which then brought into question how psychologists could or could not supervise that part of the practice. One of the things I want to be clear about is that we have, as a college, authority around supervision as it pertains to registration. So those criteria around who can supervise and what qualifications and experience they have to have, that's for the purposes of registration. Once you're an independent practitioner and you choose to engage in supervision because you have a particular skill that you want to obtain from another professional who has that experience, or because that's just a part of your approach to practice, other than making sure that it meets those criteria, which are really about protecting clients, the college doesn't have anything to say you can be supervised by anyone. It's only in that qualifying period that the Controlled Act issue exists. We're also aware that this is going to be problematic for some of the schools, especially those schools that have got, you know, these lovely multidisciplinary faculty where the norm has been for psychologists to supervise and social workers, et cetera. So it is something that we're conscious of, and we know that it's creating issues. And so very, very interested in hearing from you as to what you think the situation needs and where you're feeling it pinched, et cetera. So if you have questions about any one of those pieces of supervision, we can talk about them. So everything up to, but not including the Controlled Act, can be supervised by anyone, but if it's the Controlled Act, which we know is an imperfect definition, then the way that the Controlled Act regulation is written, they cannot. Yeah. Right, and so one of the issues that I know that the College of Psychologists is struggling with is why an independent practitioner would want supervision. So that's one of the reasons why we're hearing that some psychologists are saying they don't want to supervise anymore. But we have clarified with our colleagues that as long as it is supervision, legitimate supervision, if you're an independent practitioner and you choose to undertake supervision with one of their members and it meets your standards and it meets their standards, then that's completely permissible.
When we talk about clinical supervision for the purposes of qualifying, yes, there's the contractual relationship that says that the clinical supervisor has some responsibility through the practitioner to the client. Yes. So when you're an RP, a full RP practicing independently, doing clinical supervision with someone else, it looks a little different.
Right. Right, and so it has implications for things like informed consent, right? So when you're speaking to a new client and letting them know how you're supervised and by whom you're supervised and what they can expect, the college standards say that you need to make sure that that client has all the information and really understands who you are, how you're working, how they can access that supervisor. So Andrew's right, it does have implications for your practice. It's not something, provided that you're meeting the standards, that our college takes any issue with. So if it's supervision for the purposes of registration or transfer of category to independent practice, for example, then those criteria that the college has published do apply. You're right. So the 5 years of experience is required, and so of independent practice is required. So we recently posted an attestation form that's available for supervisors to use, and so that's what's expected of applicants, that their supervisor would complete that. If there are questions or concerns, then during the registration process, staff would follow up with the applicant to sort of figure out, if there's any more information needed. But yeah, those criteria apply for registration. No, the 30 hours of education is a one-time requirement. So once the supervisor has had that one-time 30 hours of directed learning, they're qualified and they meet the criteria that the college has laid out. It's not an annual requirement. So it's up to the practitioner. The standard requires that the client is fully aware of all the different people who might have access to their information, for example. It's all the confidentiality, exchange of information. So if you look on the, I think it's one of our recent communiques, we can make sure it's front and center, but there is sort of a list of the standards that apply and the things that you should be considering when you're looking at a supervisory relationship. So the hours are, and I'm going to embarrass myself because I'm useless at numbers. Andrew might be better at this, but there are, for the purposes of category transfer, there's a list of hours of supervision, and it's over the course of the 5 years that a new member has to achieve independent practice. And so it's listed, it's 150? I'm sorry, my registration staff is not here, and is that right, Carol? Yeah, 150. It's 150 hours. So it's about how long it takes them to get. We don't say that there's a minimum each week or there's a minimum each month. It's really working towards, so what the registration regulation requires, that somebody who's newly registered with us and not an independent practitioner must be actively working towards satisfying those requirements. So that includes direct client contact, it includes the supervision hours, and it includes successfully writing the registration exam.
And not to complicate it, but I guess the idea is that if someone is building their practice and they're working with clients, that they would be in some sort of regular supervision with those clients. I think the issue that can become problematic if someone is seeing clients, a lot of clients, but they're not supervised for some particular number. That would be a concern from a regulatory perspective.
Not with CRPO, they have to be registered to practice psychotherapy. And so, I should have clarified too that the proclamation of the Controlled Act, which we're getting to next, built in a transition period till December 2019. And so those requirements around the prohibition around other professionals being able to supervise the Controlled Act actually don't kick in until December 2019. So anybody who's currently being supervised is actually okay. It's when the transition periods end. But yes, somebody who's supervising you, if they're not working in a regulated jurisdiction, they just have to be able to demonstrate that they meet the other criteria.
And that's where the attestation form is really helpful, because you can take that to the supervisor and ask them to fill it out and say, do you meet these criteria?
Yeah. One of the things that I'll grab you in just a sec, thanks. One of the things that the committee really wrestled with when they were looking at those criteria was the issue of sort of the imbalance between somebody who's looking for supervision, new practitioners who are just entering into their professional lives, seeking supervision from people who've been around for a really long time and who, sort of have a more senior position in the profession and potentially in their job site and their community. And so, as Andrew said, that attestation form is an opportunity, we hope, for people who are looking for supervisors to go and have a frank conversation with the person who's providing supervision to make sure they do in fact meet the criteria. Question over there. Yeah, that's not something the college would have any position on. Certainly, we would encourage in the process of coming to an agreement and actually getting a contract in place, that conversation be had very explicitly and upfront. But we don't take a position on what it costs. No. Yeah. That's correct. As long as you're obligated to be supervised, once you're involved in supervision for your own, sort of practice development and personal growth, again, I would point you to the standards to make sure that the way that you're working with your supervisor really does meet those standards, and that the exchange of information and the record keeping and everything else is being done in accordance with the list of standards that are relevant to supervision. But that's, you're an independent practitioner, you're responsible for the client. Right, so there's two issues there. I'll tease them out and then hopefully sew them together. So when the government proclaimed the Controlled Act of Psychotherapy on December of last year, they built in a 2-year transition period in order to give the system time to acclimatize and make changes as needed, and to do the work that that the providers needed, that the government needed, that funders needed, to be ready for the changes that came with the proclamation of the Controlled Act. So part of that meant that the requirement that a person training to meet the requirements of a profession must be supervised by a member of that profession. Sorry, this legal language can be like a rabbit hole. That's suspended until December 2019. As of January 1st, 2020, I guess, psychologists, let's use them as an example, will not be able to supervise social workers or RP students for the Controlled Act. They could supervise for everything up to but not including, but they can't supervise for the Controlled Act, which is problematic because the Controlled Act is not like starting an IV, right? That you can say we're about to start the Controlled Act right now. So we recognize that imperfect definition of the Controlled Act, and we'll talk about that in the next slide, I gotcha, is problematic. And so the notion around informed consent, though, to go back to the other part of your question, is that the standards that exist now around information sharing, record keeping, et cetera, always apply. They still apply now. And so even if you're an independent practitioner and you are engaged in supervision and there's a sharing of information, you need to make sure your client's aware of that and consents to it. Your supervisory relationship might not involve direct sharing of information. You might choose to have sort of more supervision of your own practice as opposed to supervision of individual clients. I don't know if I'm describing that clearly, but so in that case, the way that you're working is not that client's care is being supervised. The supervisor's not assuming responsibility for them. So the twist in that is the College of Psychologists said that if they have a member who's supervising, they have standards that require that their members do assume some responsibility. And so that's where that problem around independent practitioners comes in. However, there's mentorship, there's training, there's consultation, and those things can certainly continue. And I expect that that's how most psychologists will expect to work with independent practitioners going forward. But if you are involved in supervision with a psychologist in particular, but I'm mindful that you could be supervised by social workers and others as well, you just need to, again, it goes back to the idea that you need to have a clear, candid conversation with anybody with whom you're entering into a supervisory relationship to make sure that you're both meeting standards as you're required to. The way that it's written, you cannot be trained in the supervised in the Controlled Act by anybody but somebody who is from that profession. That said, one of the things that we're aware of with these faculties that have lots of multidisciplinary involvement, they're going to be looking at this as well, and certainly anything up to but not including the Controlled Act could be supervised by somebody else. So if you have, as you said, a multidisciplinary, it's a modality where there's a particular skill that you need to learn, that could be supervised for sure. But when you're coming forward with supervised hours for the purposes of registration, and it includes the Controlled Act, and we're going to communicate more on this. One of the things that we're trying to do is work with our colleagues to make sure that we're all putting the same message out there. And so stay tuned, because there is more information coming as that happens. And I would like to see us actually move the needle a little bit and sort of get some recognition that interdisciplinary education is important and valuable and should be, protected. So the Controlled Act, just a little bit of background, forgive me if everybody knows this, but just to make sure everybody's got the same information. The Controlled Act of Psychotherapy was part of the 2007 act that created the college, and that took some years to come to fruition as the college being proclaimed. the government, in its wisdom, chose not to proclaim the Controlled Act at the same time, in part because it just wasn't ready. There are 6 colleges, 6 professions that have access to the Controlled Act. There was a lack of agreement on what that looked like and how it should be defined. They have this 5-part definition that sort of draws the edges of the Controlled Act, and there was much consternation about exactly the issues that you just raised about what it would do for services and service interruption, continuity of care, et cetera. So in February of 2016, 17, before the grandparenting provision ended, the ministry decided to reconvene all those colleges because the Controlled Act had to be proclaimed by December of last year, or it reached the sunset clause of 10 years and it would fall off the table. Government doesn't like to have regulations sitting and have them disappear. They do everything they can to either make them happen or to revise them if needed. So the decision was taken by government to proclaim the Controlled Act, and what they did was they came back to the College of Psychotherapists and said, okay, so you guys are the ones who have the responsibility for all the people who are currently not registered and are looking to be registered with you. The other professions, this is not their scope of practice, it's just one piece of their practice. And so we were tasked with doing the work of drafting a regulation that would define those therapies that were prescribed in regulation as being psychotherapy. So a note around the word prescribed, because I know that it sets a lot of people's teeth on edge. It's the legal version of prescribed, as in to state or to dictate, not the medical, as in it's a medical model. There's no connection with the medical model at all, but I know that that caused some consternation in the psychotherapy community. So we were charged with creating a regulation that defined what practices were inside the scope of psychotherapy, and then what activities were not part of the Controlled Act. So the approach that we took was to draft the regulation as broadly as possible, take the same approach that the college had taken with regards to registration. And you all know this, that it depends on which website you look at. Are there 200 modalities? Are there 400? Are there 700? We knew that if we tried to create a list that we would, definitely be excluding some of the ways in which our members practice. So we tried very hard to make sure that the categories that we landed on were ones that were broad enough and that our members would be able to see their practice in there in one form or another. The policy on those activities that are not part of the Controlled Act come from registering 6,000 people and refusing, a good 1,000 others at this stage. So our registration committee has spent the last 3 years combing through grandparenting applications, which, as you probably know, since many or most of you probably came in through the grandparenting route, are really detailed portfolios that talk extensively about your training, your experience, your practice, the professional development, all the work that you've done. And so this group on the registration committee has, of anybody in the province, I think the best sense of what's inside the scope, what's inside the Controlled Act as it's currently defined and what's not. And so the work that we've done and that you'll see making its way out into the world over the next few months is really intended to help direct people like the folks that you're talking about who don't currently reside inside the college as to whether they need to regulate or not. There's a lot of people out there who are doing really good, important work, but it's not the Controlled Act and they don't need to regulate. And from the college's perspective, there's no reason why what the proclamation of the Controlled Act says or the work that we've done says should preclude them from continuing on with their work. So the flip side to that is that we are currently involved with an advisory committee that's intergovernmental. So it's they keep changing their names, so I can't keep up. But Children and Youth Services, Status of Women, the Attorney General, and Health, and a number of branches under each of those. And they've got the next however long, we've got 14 months, good grief, before the transition period ends, to work on those implementation issues. What does it mean? For example, in the children and youth sector, where, as you say, there's one regulated professional working with a whole host of unregulated professionals providing services to a good number of people. What does that look like? So the college has been very clear, and I will continue to be clear, that the work that we've done is not at all intended to disrupt service. It's not intended to be a way for the ministry to come in and change the way that services are funded or that services are delivered. It's about clarifying who's qualified and then figuring out from there. We've already seen some of the children's groups, for example, take up the work that we have done, and they're turning into a toolkit that will use the self-assessment that we've created for unregulated providers to figure out if they are in fact practicing in the scope and using the Controlled Act and therefore need to register. So they've taken that and they've turned it into a tool that organizations and service provider organizations and institutions will be able to use. So the work is starting. The ministry, it hasn't left us a whole lot of time, but Carol Cowan-Levine and myself sit on the committee, and they're very engaged in figuring out those systems issues. We will continue to represent psychotherapists at that table and to make sure that it's clear where our members are at and what's going on. But it's in the hands of government now in terms of figuring out what it'll look like. So we will continue probably to come back. I mean, we will be back and forth with members, but there may very well be more consultation needed that the government will be running, and we'll be making sure that you're aware of that. So in terms of the rest of the work on the Controlled Act, there's a companion document for RPs that we'll be releasing. We had a huge response to our circulation and consultation, so thank you to everybody in the room. I'm sure many of you completed it. We got some really very thoughtful, very helpful suggestions through the course of those multiple iterations. The committee, I can tell you, considered every last comment that came in. We spent an awful lot of time combing through what people had to say, reading the letters. I spent a lot of time meeting with different organizations and having conversations with people, and I think that I would love to be able to show you there were 14 or 15 versions by the time we were done, the red lines, as we tracked changes and made tweaks. And I think that at the end of the day, the documents that we've got go much further than the sort of the definition document that came out in February. That was meant for professionals. Candidly speaking, I don't think that it did much to help the public. We also have a document that will go out to Ontarians, and it'll be posted on our website, and that we'll be promoting to help them understand what they should expect of their regulated provider, and in particular of their registered psychotherapist. So there's a lot more work to be done over the next 14 months, and my blood runs cold every time I say that number. It seemed like such a long time when the proclamation happened, but as those things happen, it's time has sifted away. So we're still working on it. We will be communicating more, but I'm very interested in hearing where people are at, whether you've sort of wrestled it and feel like you have an understanding of where it fits in your practice. If there's anything else that you would have us take back to government, we're really keen to hear from you. There are none. Once you've received independent practice status.
Yeah, do you need to get any supervision hours?
So supervision can be ordered in response to a complaint or a report, and so those would be places where the college would require supervision. But in the general course of things, if you're, as an independent practitioner, choosing to undertake supervision, that absolutely is your choice. But again, I'm sounding a bit like a broken record, but those standards would apply in terms of making sure that your supervisory relationship was not creating any conflict with the standards of care. I guess the other piece that we should make clear is the distinction between clinical supervision and workplace supervision is something that is that you're at the mercy of the organization you work for when it comes to the workplace supervision, right? And I know, and it comes down to human resources and budget and everything else, so for sure. But happy to look at that. I mean, in fact, we have looked at and begun conversations about what our standards do for members and do to members in terms of interprofessional function in a team. So your point's very well taken. If it's for the purposes of registration, yes.
Only for registration?
Yeah. Again, our authority really in terms of who supervises whom is for the purposes of registration. So getting into the college, changing status, category transfers, and then that's the standards are there in the background guiding you around what's expected in terms of what that relationship looks like. So there's still requirements around making sure that the clients are protected. Sorry, the question was, would it qualify for quality assurance? The answer is yes. This is a catch-all for a number of issues, and so I hope we can spend some time on there. I want to preface this by saying that we recognize that there are system issues that are significant for members and their ability to sustain their practices. We hear this coming through in a variety of different ways, and we recognize that this is really important. So we can deal with fees under this slide, for example. So we get questions about when will fees go down, why are fees going up, and I wanted to address that. So we have a legal requirement to see through every complaint and report that we receive to its end. So that could be take no action, it could be discipline. And so the costs associated with that must be available so that the college can fulfill its mandate of public protection. We also are obligated to have a fund to provide up to $16,000 for each individual who comes forward having been sexually abused by one of our members. And so there's a fund that's absolutely mandated that we have available. We also need to conduct fair and thorough investigations. So, and as members, you want this, right? If there's a complaint that's made against you, you want us to be thorough. You want us to turn over, all the stones, find all the facts, do the interviews, do the work that's required to ensure that the panel that is presiding over a complaint or report case has all the relevant information in front of it in order to make a fair and appropriate decision. And so that can be costly. It's also QA support services. So for example, the 6 practice advisors that we have available to you, the work that we're doing to create resources. And the bulk so what I wanted to say was that the bulk of our fee increases are actually around penalties. So we chose to go as lightly as we could in terms of increasing the renewal fee. But the ones that you saw where there were what probably felt like stark increases were to transfer costs back to those people who incur them. So every time somebody misses a renewal deadline or doesn't have their professional liability in place, it creates work for the college that we then go out and do. And if you're somebody who does renew on time and you do have your professional liability insurance in place, we saw no reason to ask you to cover the cost for the portion of the membership that doesn't. And so those fees went up considerably in order to accommodate that. So, the other question that we get is, but social work fees are so cheap, how come? There's a lot more of them. And so the fixed costs are spread over many more members than the 6,000 that we have. We have to build reserves. As a new college, we're working really hard to make sure we have appropriate infrastructure in place. Not to put my colleagues at the College of Nurses on the hot spot, but they just got an online application and renewal system off the ground. We've had one right from the get-go. So they've had many years of paper-based work, which is much more labor-intensive. So the college has been trying very hard to make careful, thoughtful decisions about what we do and how we do it. And so we recognize that for people who work part-time, one of the questions that we often get is, how come I have to pay as much as the person who works next to me and works full-time? Because at the end of the day, the fixed costs of regulating you, whether you see 4 patients a week or clients a week, or whether you see 40 clients a week, is the same. If there was a complaint against you from one of those 4 clients, it would cost exactly the same to investigate as it would for those 40 clients. And so unfortunately, we're not in a position to be able to offer any kind of graduated fees. But we do recognize that many of you, especially those in private practice, are business people as well as providers, and that you're thoughtful about how you spend your money. And so I want to reassure you that we're as careful as we can be with every cent, and that's why we don't have a fund for education and all the whistles and bells that people sort of think that they should be getting. What I will commit to is that we are working really hard on those quality assurance resources, because those are the ones that are really an add value for all of you proactively, and hopefully you'll find them useful. I also wanted to note that we appreciate our role in ensuring the sustainability in the face of increased demand for services and acuity of the care needs that clients who are seeking care in the community are bringing to you as practitioners. And so we see the issues of third-party billing and the coverage as a barrier to access to care. And while we don't take a position, regulatory colleges have nothing to do with funding or fees or remuneration. It's not appropriate for the protector of the public to comment or weigh in on that. That's where your association gets to take the limelight. We do feel that the barrier to access that those kinds of issues represent is problematic. And so we're working on statements, and we are putting out there the work that we need to around things like ODSB authorization, so that you can do the paperwork that your clients need in order to get that. Authority to be the second referral for gender affirmation surgery. We see that somebody who's developed a relationship with you and is receiving care from you and has a good working therapeutic relationship shouldn't have to go to somebody else to get that last piece of paper that they need in order to get the care that they deserve. Same with inclusion in the government MVA coverage policies. So all those places where it really is about an access to care issue, the college is there. We know that your associations are doing a great job of pushing in that direction, and I see our work as being very cooperative. on that front. And so our job is not to stand up and ask for money for you, but it is to stand up and say you are regulated providers who are accountable, competent, and that you're providing safe and ethical care. And so that protected title piece, that's really important, and that's where the college is, in fact, supporting members in a way that it might not feel quite as overt as the way the associations do, but we're definitely there doing it. I think the other piece that, just sort of in general that we want to underscore is that by setting rigorous entry to practice requirements, by making sure that QA is something that's meaningful, by making sure that supervision is something that's robust, all of that sort of speaks to the accountability and solidity of the profession. And so while all these things are there and we know that they are a struggle for you in terms of getting up and getting your practice off the ground if you're a new practitioner, or maintaining your practice if you're getting ready to retire, or if you're having a baby, and all those things that life kind of brings forward while you're trying to run your clinical practice. So just wanting to sort of loop back to that right touch regulation idea, our goal is not to inhibit your ability to provide care. It's to support you in providing good care and to help you course correct when that maybe doesn't happen in the way that it needs to. So I am very happy to hear from you, because I know that these are the issues that sort of burn. We certainly see these in a lot of the surveys that have gone out, and so would just like to open the floor and take comments, and I suspect probably comments as much as questions, but either are very, very welcome. Yeah. No, it's a good question. It's one that we have started to look at. We're very conscious of the fact that there are different standards, right? So the privacy commissioner, the hospital you work in, the college's standards. For the record, the way that the legislation is written is that the highest standard is the one that you're accountable to. If one conflicts with another, you're to sort of go with the highest standard. But I'm very conscious of that. I worked in primary care before I came here, and I saw how the team approach, which was best for the client, the patient, sometimes meant that information got exchanged in less formal ways and could be problematic. So we're looking at working specifically with the standard around informed consent and privacy and information sharing to help interpret it. What I would suggest is if you ever have specific questions, then the practice advisory line is there for you. But at the end of the day, I think the other pieces that come into play are documentation. So you may not have them sign something because that would be detrimental to your relationship and their ability or willingness to take care with you. But if you document that you, as you described, you tell them your qualifications, what you're there to do, and you're covering the bases, those wouldn't be places where the college would find fault with your practice. So I think that the position statement that we're looking at in terms of what the college's take on barriers to care would apply to that. So it's really about saying that people in Ontario have the right to choose who their care provider is, and that RPs are a qualified army of 6,000 working across in many settings with very vulnerable populations in some cases, and that they are accountable and regulated, and they tick all the boxes in terms of being safe, ethical practitioners. And so that would be something that we would see contributing. We would not be in a position to lobby. That's what your association does for you. But I agree, it's a barrier to access, and it differentiates the psychotherapy that you're able to provide as if it was sort of a luxury good that people were choosing to buy, as opposed to a healthcare service that they needed to receive. So going back to that, and it's frustrating because I understand that you would, I can understand why it feels like we're not coming out of the woods as far as we might, but we have to be careful, because if we were ever to be seen to be lobbying or advocating on something that was in the interest of practitioners, which it could be argued HST, insurance, OHIP, all that kind of stuff that's to do with money could be perceived as being, we would lose the public trust. And so we have to be really careful to make sure that we are couching things in the lens of public protection, and so that's why the position statement would be the response to that. But it would be something that we would post, that we would encourage you to use in your communication with government and your lobbying. Certainly the language has already started to make its way into all of the communication that we're doing. So for example, we wrote to the Financial Commission Services Ontario and said, regulated providers here ready to provide motor vehicle accident support should be on the list. And so it's being considered. I know the associations were working on that too. So that language we're going to be consistent in using that, and then we'd encourage you to pick that up and use it too. But the three pillars of a healthy profession are strong regulation, excellent education, and a robust professional association. All three are needed, and the healthy tension between those three is really what keeps professions, I think, sustainable and growing and providing service as the system gets harder and harder to work in. We recognize that. So we have about 15 minutes left. Wanted to move on to the next slide and pass it off to Andrew, unless there was something that somebody really wanted to get in there. Sure, Bob. So we are definitely working with our colleagues from the other colleges that have access to the Controlled Act, both in terms of the documents that we're about to publicize and the implementation issues that the member over there raised. Not looking at shared standards at this point. Certainly we are in touch with the other colleges and have conversations with them where it might seem that where standards conflict with each other, but there's no, in the works right now to have shared standards, but very much to have consistent messaging around the Controlled Act we recognize is important. And they were engaged in the work that we did leading up to the submission of the regulation, and they'll continue to be involved as we go forward. Sure. So that's actually a very good segue into strategic planning, which Andrew is going to talk about next. So if you're okay with that, we can sort of just put a pin in it. What I will say is that our the people with whom we work at the ministry have remained consistent. Our ADM continues to be the same person, and the staff is there. I don't know if that'll hold out for indefinitely, but we have an engaged group at the government. We work closely with them. If you come to our council meetings, you'll see that they attend those meetings, and there's a lot of work going on. I mean, a lot of what we're doing around the right touch regulation is looking at the direction that the ministry has been pointing in terms of making sure that we're having an effect and that we're actually doing the work that we've been asked to do. Yeah, that's a good question. It's interesting because it's one of the questions that plagues every college in the province, right? Because it's typically one of those things where people don't come looking for us until they need us for the most part. So we have a register that lists everybody in their practice setting and all the information about their current practice. And we know that it's underused, and that's the same for the 25 other health colleges. So we do have work to do collectively as a federation of regulated health colleges. Certainly our college as a new college has work to do. So the public lens and information for the public is one that we apply to most of the work that we do. Certainly the Controlled Act gives us an opportunity to do more work on that front, and we participate in collective efforts to make sure that the notion of regulated professional versus unregulated professional is out there. So it's something that I think we have to constantly turn our attention to. It's there again, to point it to sort of strategic planning. We have some decisions to make going forward in terms of trying to decide what's the best way to make sure that members are supported and ready to go, and that the public is aware of the work that our members are doing and the credentials and the competence and the continuing PD they do. So those were during the transitional council days, and I think that was, sort of a time-limited effort. The problem with that is that that's only people in Toronto, right? So what do? We protect everybody in Ontario, and so that sort of more broad-based outreach is needed. But it's been a tension for colleges since we appeared on the scene in terms of having this, split between the people we protect and the people we regulate, and sort of the unwilling customer kind of concept of somebody who's only going to come to us when they have a complaint. And so what do we do to make sure that we're out there proactively in the same way that that we know you are? So I'm going to pass off to Andrew. Thank you very much. No, oh well, there's more.
Thank you, Deb. A lot of information. I just want to, so as we look at strategic planning, I want to pick up a thread from the last couple questions actually. Bob asked about psychotherapy across the colleges that have access to the Controlled Act. And there was a comment in the HPRAC report that came out late in 2017 that actually talked about the opportunity for the colleges to work together. Where that goes, I don't know. I don't know sort of where that, if it's a cooperative effort through those colleges or whether there's sort of a ministry saying, please look at this. I don't know, but it's certainly something that's there for the future. Absolutely. Also to say then, to pick up on Deb's comment, that the Assistant Deputy Minister, Denise Cole, is sort of the, I guess, is the minister.
She's responsible for colleges, yeah.
So she's responsible for colleges that are talking to each other at FERCO. And so this idea that right touch regulation is a notion that is being sort of picked up in the regulatory environment is really, I think, important for us. So let me segue then to say that as we look at our strategic planning, we really, as we've had the few opportunities to mention right touch regulation, everyone seems to nod their head and say that makes a lot of sense. We're really wanting to find that right line between having the right amount of regulation but not being over-regulated, and one of my words is to be too bureaucratic, as it were. As you'll know, I mean, we're a young college, and we haven't had a strategic plan before. Right now, we're operating based on the thinking, the regulations, how things were operationalized by the transitional council, and the college in these first few years. So as we look at our strategic planning, we certainly welcome what you've got to tell us about your experience, because I think in some sense, sitting in the position I've had the opportunity and the privilege to sit in, I think there's a lot that we do fairly well enough. And so our strategic plan may be about adjusting, tweaking, hearing your voices, and kind of understanding where we might want to go in these next 3 years. In terms of timing, this is a process that we're bringing to council in November, and then again we've got a full day in February. So we hope probably into the middle of next year we'll have more to say. We might even have perhaps a completed plan by then to share. Deb is saying yes, so there we go. Thank you really for your input today. It really has been valuable. It's interesting to hear the questions that you've raised. I'm looking forward to sort of seeing what's come up on the charts on the side as well, to see if it matches up with what we've heard. For all those who have registered, you're going to be getting an evaluation form that you can do online, and we really do look forward to that. Please be candid. As Deb said, we really do read through all of the feedback that we get, certainly here, certainly through the public consultations. So please know that you are being heard. So.
It's really nice to see people making it out, as I said, in such a miserable day. We're here, the phones are there, the info line is there. It's really important that we have an opportunity to stay engaged with our membership. It's really the best way for us to make sure that what we're doing is landing where it needs to. Our council is really effective and well-trained and thoughtful and engaged, and made up of 51% professionals working in the field, but you guys are the ones that are actually living with the regulations that we're creating, and so we need to hear from you, and I would much rather hear from you proactively than after the fact when you're unhappy with us. So please do reach out. So we're just starting to collect information. This is our first foray into sort of the public realm. We've certainly been doing a lot of research. So we will be moving forward over the course of the next 3 or 4 months, developing the plan. And so everything that we've heard today will feed back into it. And certainly anything that gets created, as Andrew said, will be shared. But there'll be opportunities for, in the other 3 town halls. And it remains sort of under development in terms of what other outreach we're going to do. But our goal is to really make sure that you're heard. And the questions that are posted up there are the ones that we're sort of starting off with in terms of asking.
And also to add, if before we close today, and we'll take 5 or 10 minutes, if anybody wants to add anything, by all means, please do.
So thank you again for coming out. We hope that it was useful, and we look forward to hearing from you.